At 6:47 on a Tuesday morning, the Hargrove Tower elevator system failed with a federal judge, 2 US Marshals, and the key witness in a $340 million securities fraud trial trapped between the 31st and 32nd floors. The building's chief engineer had called in sick. His backup had a certification that didn't cover hydraulic traction systems. The elevator company's emergency technician was 40 minutes out, minimum. The trial was scheduled to begin at 9 a.m. in the courtroom on the 34th floor. Judge Patricia Welling had already sent word through her clerk that she would not delay. The prosecutor's office had spent 11 months building this case. If the witness didn't testify today, the defense would move for dismissal on grounds of material delay, and they would probably get it. There was one man in the building who could fix it in under an hour. He was in the basement replacing a fluorescent bulb in the janitorial supply room. His name was Cliff Eason. He was 53 years old and his ID badge read C. Eason, Facilities and Maintenance, and the guard at the loading dock had been waving him through that entrance for 9 years without once asking what the C stood for. It stood for Clifford, which he'd never liked, so he went by Cliff, and most of the people in the building who knew him at all knew him as the tall, quiet man who fixed the things that broke before anyone else noticed they were broken. He had arrived at 5:30, the way he always did, earlier than his shift required. He liked the building when it was still. He liked the particular quality of the silence in the lower floors before the lawyers and the paralegals and the executive assistants arrived with their coffee and their urgency and their absolute certainty that every problem they were carrying was the most important problem in the building. He wasn't being unkind about it. He understood urgency. He'd spent 18 years learning what real urgency looked like, and he'd learned it in places that made a delayed trial look like a postponed lunch. He had worked in this building since the fall his son Isaac turned 7. That was the year he'd moved them both from Cincinnati to Chicago and started over with the kind of deliberate simplicity that people choose when the complicated version of their life has cost them too much to rebuild from scratch. He needed hours that were fixed and predictable. He needed to be reachable. He needed, above everything, to be the person Isaac could count on to be there, which meant he needed a job that didn't ask him for more than he'd agreed to give. Hargrove Tower Facilities paid reliably and asked nothing extra. That had been enough for 9 years. He was finishing with the bulb when his radio crackled. It was Deb Foley from the building operations desk, and he could tell from the first syllable that something had gone wrong in a way that wasn't going to be resolved with a work order. Cliff, we have a situation with elevator bank C car 3 is stopped between 31 and 32, passengers inside. Building management is on the phone with Otis, but their tech is 40+ minutes out. He set down the bulb packaging. How many passengers? 5, including 2 federal officers. He picked up his bag and walked toward the stairwell without answering, because the answer was obvious and explaining it would cost time he didn't want to spend. The mechanical room for elevator bank C was on the 33rd floor, accessible through a corridor that most people in the building had never seen and wouldn't have known to look for. Cliff knew where it was the way he knew where everything in this building was. Not because he'd been told, but because he had spent 9 years paying attention to it the way some people paid attention to their children's faces. Constantly, automatically, with the particular care of someone who understood that the details were where everything either held together or came apart. He took the stairs, all 33 flights. He wasn't running, but he wasn't taking them casually either. The bag on his shoulder was a worn canvas duffel he'd had for longer than Isaac had been alive, and it held tools that most facilities workers didn't carry and wouldn't know how to use. He carried them anyway, the same way he carried the knowledge behind them. Not because he was planning to use it, but because putting it down entirely had never quite felt like something he was capable of. On the 19th floor landing, his phone buzzed. He checked it without breaking stride. A text from Isaac. Can you make the 3:30 pickup today, or should I go to Nate's? He typed back with one hand, I'll be there. 3:30. He kept moving. The Hargrove Tower was a 40-story mixed-use commercial building in the West Loop, home to 3 law firms, a federal satellite courthouse on floors 32 through 38, a regional investment office, and approximately 1,400 people on any given weekday who treated the elevator system the way they treated all infrastructure, as an invisible constant that they only noticed when it stopped working. The building had 3 elevator banks. Bank A served floors 1 through 15. Bank B served 16 through 30, Bank C served 31 through 40, and was the only bank with direct access to the federal courthouse floors. It was a hydraulic traction system, installed during a renovation 11 years ago, and it had one documented design tendency that Cliff had flagged in a maintenance report 4 years earlier. The report had been filed, acknowledged, and not acted on because the fix required a scheduled shutdown and no one on the building management side wanted to coordinate a shutdown with the federal court schedule. The system had worked fine in the interim, until this morning. He reached the 33rd floor mechanical room at 7:04. He unclipped the key ring from his belt, found the right key without looking. He had 31 keys and knew each one by the shape of its teeth, and let himself in. The room smelled like machine oil and recycled air. The overhead fluorescents hummed at a frequency just below audible. Banks of equipment lined 3 walls: the traction machine assembly, the controller cabinet, the brake release panel. On the status display above the controller, Car 3 showed as halted at level 31.5. The door contact sensor was reading green, which meant the doors were sealed. The safety brake had engaged automatically when the car stopped. Cliff set his bag on the metal work table and looked at the controller display for about 4 seconds. Then he opened the controller cabinet. Inside, the wiring harness for the traveling cable showed what he'd expected to see. A connector block in the secondary position sensor circuit had developed a micro-separation, a gap of less than a millimeter at the contact point, caused by repeated thermal expansion and contraction over a long operating cycle. It was the same failure mode he had described in his maintenance report. The controller was reading the incomplete signal as a safety-critical fault and was holding the brake. The car itself was fine. The passengers were in no danger. The system had done exactly what it was supposed to do when it couldn't verify position. It had stopped and waited. The fix was not complicated if you understood what you were looking at. Cliff understood what he was looking at. His radio crackled again. This time it was a voice he didn't recognize. Male, tight, with a particular kind of controlled stress that he associated with people who were accustomed to being in charge and were currently not in charge of anything. "This is Assistant U.S. Attorney Brendan Mast. I need to know who's working on this elevator and what the timeline is." Cliff looked at the connector block. "I'm looking at the fault now. 40 minutes, maybe less." A pause. "Who is this?" "Cliff Eason, Facilities." Another pause, longer. "The building engineer isn't available?" "No." "And you're Facilities Maintenance?" "Yes." The pause this time had a different quality, not hostile, more like a Mon rapidly recalculating something he'd been certain about. "Okay," Mast said finally, and the word came out like a man setting down something heavy. "Okay, keep me posted." Cliff set the radio on the table and returned to the controller cabinet. The connector block required a contact cleaning and a reset of the position sensor circuit. He carried contact cleaner in his bag because he had learned a long time ago that the right tool carried in advance was worth more than the fastest possible response time. He cleaned the contact surfaces, reseated the connector block, and used a calibrated torque driver to secure the retention clip to spec. Then he opened the manual override panel and ran the position sensor diagnostic sequence. The display blinked, reacquired, level 31.5. He ran it again to confirm, same reading, stable. He reached for the brake release panel and lifted the manual interlock cover. Before he touched the release, he stopped. He thought about the report he'd filed 4 years ago. He thought about the fact that this failure mode had been documented, predictable, and unfixed for reasons that had nothing to do with engineering and everything to do with scheduling convenience. He thought about the 5 people sitting in that car right now who had no idea why they were stopped, who were depending entirely on the competence of whoever was in this room, and who had been relying, without knowing it, on a system that had been allowed to carry a known defect for 4 years because the paperwork was inconvenient. He engaged the brake release. Status display updated. Car 3, level 31.5, moving to level 32. Door hold release active. He watched the display until the car reached the floor and the door contact sensors switched to open. Then he wrote the repair action in the building maintenance log. Connector block secondary position sensor circuit, bank C car 3, contact separation failure, cleaned and reseated, diagnostic confirmed, dated it, timed it at 7:41, and signed it with his full name. He gathered his tools, replaced them in the bag in the order they had come out, and zipped it closed. He was heading toward the stairwell door when he heard footsteps coming down the corridor from the elevator lobby. Quick, purposeful footsteps that slowed when they reached the mechanical room door. He turned. The man standing in the doorway was somewhere in his mid-40s, dark suit, the loosened slightly that suggested he'd been moving fast. Behind him, half a step back, was a younger woman in a gray blazer with a lanyard and a tablet. She looked like she was building a timeline in her head in real time. The man looked at Cliff. He looked at the maintenance log on the table. He looked at the bag. "You fixed it," he said. "It wasn't quite a question." "Yes," he exhaled. It was the kind of exhale that a person releases when they've been holding something in their chest for 45 minutes and have just been told they can set it down. "Brendan Mast," he said. "We spoke on the radio." "I know." Mast looked at him for a moment with the frank, assessing look of a man who processed information professionally and was currently processing something that didn't fit the framework he'd walked in with. How long have you worked here? 9 years, and you knew exactly what the problem was. Cliff picked up his bag. I filed a report about it 4 years ago. Mast went still. A report, maintenance report, identified the failure mode, recommended a preventive fix during the next scheduled shutdown. It's in the building file. The woman in the gray blazer, Mast's paralegal or associate, Cliff thought from the way she was positioned, had stopped building her timeline and was looking at him with an expression he recognized. It was the expression of someone who was reordering their assumptions about a room they'd walked into. He'd seen it before, he knew what it meant, and he also knew it didn't change anything practical, so he let it settle and didn't perform anything in response. "What was your background before this?" Mast asked. Not intrusively, genuinely. Cliff said certification in hydraulic traction systems, did field work for about 15 years. For who? Cliff was quiet for a moment, not evasive, just measuring, a company that handled systems for federal buildings, mostly. Courthouse's GSA-managed properties. Filed the technical spec for the Bank C system in this building actually when it was installed 11 years ago. Mast looked at him for a long time. Outside the mechanical room, from somewhere further down the corridor, Cliff could hear the sound of people moving, the US Marshals, probably, making sure the witness was where they needed him to be. "You designed the system," Mast said. "My team did. I was lease engineer, and now you." Mast stopped himself. The sentence had a direction he clearly thought better of. Cliff didn't finish it for him. He understood the gap the man was trying not to name, and he also understood that it wasn't Mast's business, and that explaining it was not something he owed to anyone in this corridor at 7:44 in the morning. What he had told no one in this building in 9 years was this. In the spring of the year Isaac turned 4, Cliff Eason had been lead systems engineer at Veltris Elevator Technologies, a mid-size firm that held service contracts for 46 federally managed buildings across the Midwest. He had been, by any measure that mattered in that industry, very good at his job. The kind of good that gets you promoted faster than the org chart expects and put on projects that aren't in your original scope. And then in March of that year, during a routine compliance audit of a courthouse installation in Cincinnati, he had found a documentation irregularity in a load test certification for 4 elevator systems in a building currently under occupancy. The certification had been signed. The load tests had not been performed. Someone above him had approved a sign-off on work that hadn't been done, because the work would have required a 2-week shutdown and the courthouse was in the middle of a high-profile trial, and the client had asked, informally, in the kind of conversation that doesn't produce a paper trail, if there was any flexibility. There was no flexibility. That was Cliff's position. A hydraulic traction system in a federal courthouse does not get a conditional sign-off because a trial is running long. He had put this in writing. He had sent it to his supervisor. He had copied the GSA project lead. 3 weeks later, he was informed that his position was being eliminated as part of a company restructuring. He was 38. Isaac was 4. Sarah had died the previous winter, 10 days after a diagnosis that hadn't given them enough time to do anything but hold on. And Cliff had been doing the work of 2 parents and 1 grief-stricken adult for the better part of 8 months. He was not in a position to fight a wrongful termination battle with a company that had the resources to make it last 2 years. He needed income and stability and proximity to his son more than he needed vindication. He took what mattered, which was Isaac, and he moved, and he started over. The courthouse in Cincinnati had eventually undergone a full compliance reinspection 2 years later, mandated by a different audit. The irregularities had been found and corrected. No one had been hurt. The company had paid a fine. None of this had appeared in any coverage that would have connected it to a man mopping floors, or in Cliff's case, maintaining elevator systems, in a Chicago high-rise. He had never told any of this to anyone in the Hargrove Tower. It wasn't relevant to the job he'd agreed to do. And he had, over 9 years, made a genuine and largely successful peace with the life he'd chosen. He had Isaac. He had the building. He had the particular satisfaction that came from knowing a complex system so well that you could feel when something was wrong before the sensors caught it. Most mornings that was enough. He was almost to the stairwell when Mast said, "Mr. Eason." Cliff stopped, turned back. He was beginning to recognize this as the shape the morning was going to take. Mast was standing in the corridor, the associate with the tablet still a step behind him, and his expression had changed from the controlled stress of 40 minutes ago into something more deliberate, more considered. "There are 47 people on those courthouse floors who have a trial starting in 1 hour and 12 minutes, Mast said. It starts because you were in the basement at 6:47 this morning and you knew exactly what was wrong." Cliff didn't say anything. "I'd like to know why you're in maintenance and not running a systems engineering firm." I have a son, Cliff said. He needs me available. Mast absorbed this. How old is he? 16. Something in Mast's face shifted slightly, not sentimentality, more like recognition. My daughter is 13, he said. I understand. The associate had stopped recording her timeline entirely. She was just standing there. I don't need an explanation, Mast said. I'm not asking for one. I just want to say, what you did this morning isn't a small thing. Whatever the circumstances, he paused. And if you ever want to have a different conversation about what you know and what use it might be put to, I work on the 36th floor, room 3612. Cliff looked at him. I know where 3612 is. A small, brief thing crossed Mast's face that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to it. Of course you do. Cliff took the stairs back down, all 33 flights. His knees were better than they had a right to be for a man his age, which was one of the benefits of taking the stairs every day for 9 years. He was on the 21st floor landing when his phone buzzed again. A different number this time, the building management office. He let it ring. They would want to know what had been done and how and by whom, and the maintenance log had all of that information, and he would answer their questions when they asked them in person, which was how he preferred to have those conversations. On the 14th floor, his phone buzzed with a text from the same unknown number. He glanced at it. This is Mast's assistant, Joanna. He wanted me to ask, and he said to tell you this isn't a formal inquiry, it's a personal question, what the name was on the original installation spec for Bank C, for the Hargrove Tower system. He thinks he may have seen it before. Cliff held the phone for a moment on the landing, the stairwell quiet around him, the building moving and breathing above him the way it always did. He typed back, C. Eason, Veltris Elevator Technologies, 2013. He put the phone in his pocket and kept walking. When he came out of the stairwell into the basement corridor, the supply room light he'd replaced was on, clean and steady, the new bulb doing exactly what it was supposed to do. He stood there for a moment and looked at it the way he sometimes did with things that were working correctly. Not because it was remarkable, because it wasn't. Because most of the work that kept a building functional was invisible and unremarkable and mattered more for exactly that reason. He went to the break room and poured himself a coffee. He sat at the table where he sat most mornings and checked the maintenance schedule for the rest of the day. A pressure valve on the 12th floor HVAC, a door seal on the loading dock, a light rail track inspection on the 8th floor interior. Normal things. The work of a building that was on most days a reliable and ordinary place. He drank his coffee. He did not think about what Mast had said, or rather he thought about it the way he thought about most things that required consideration, at a distance, without urgency, setting it in a place where it would wait for him to be ready to pick it up. At 2:55 in the afternoon, he clocked out, changed out of his work clothes in the locker room, and took the main elevator, Bank A different system entirely, down to the lobby. He walked the 6 blocks to Isaac's school. He was there at 3:28, which was early, so he stood near the front steps in the thin October sun and watched the school buses line up the way he'd watched them line up for 9 years, since Isaac was a second grader who still needed help with the buckle on his backpack. Isaac came through the front doors at 3:34, which was right on time. He was tall for 16, taller than Cliff by almost 2 inches now, which had happened gradually and then suddenly in the way those things did. He had his mother's way of walking, slightly angled, like he was always headed somewhere slightly to the left of the most direct path. He saw Cliff and made the face that 16-year-olds made when they were pleased to see someone and were not yet comfortable showing it openly. It was a face Cliff had learned to read. You made it, Isaac said. I said I would. Isaac fell into step beside him. They walked in the direction of the L stop. For half a block neither of them said anything, which was one of the things Cliff had always liked about his son. He didn't fill silence with noise just because it was there. You have a good day, Isaac. Interesting morning. Isaac glanced at him sideways. Interesting like the time you found the gas leak, or interesting like the time the CFO got stuck in the freight elevator? Different kind of interesting, okay. Isaac accepted this and returned his gaze to the sidewalk ahead. He had learned at some age Cliff couldn't quite identify, not to push, which was another thing Sarah had done, and seeing it in their son still sometimes caught Cliff off guard in a way that was not entirely sad. After another half block, Isaac said, Was it the kind of interesting you'll tell me about eventually? Cliff thought about a connector block the size of his fist. He thought about a status display reading level 32. He thought about 47 people who had gotten to where they were going because someone in a basement had paid attention for 9 years. Yeah, he said, eventually. Isaac nodded like this was a satisfactory answer because for him it was. He knew his father. He knew that eventually was a promise, not a deflection, and that Cliff Eason kept his promises with the same reliability he brought to everything else. Not loudly, not with announcement, but completely and without exception. At the L stop, while they waited for the train, Isaac said without particular weight, "Coach Tillman asked if you'd come talk to the engineering club. They're doing a unit on how buildings work. Whenever, he said you could pick the date." Cliff looked at the track. The train was 2 stops out, the light moving toward them through the gray afternoon. "Tell him I'll come," he said. Isaac looked at him. Yeah. The train arrived. They got on. The doors closed. Outside the window, the West Loop moved past in its ordinary way. Buildings and streets and the specific late afternoon light of a city that had kept going all day regardless of what any particular person inside it had been through. In his jacket pocket, folded once, was a business card that Joanna had pressed into his hand at the elevator bank when he'd passed through the lobby on his way out. Mast's name was on it, a direct number. On the back, in pen, she had written, "Not pressure, just a door." Cliff looked at it once on the train, the way you looked at something you weren't ready to decide about. Then he put it back in his pocket. He did not throw it away.